What is up, you guys? Thank you so much for tuning in with me. So I wanted to come out here and film a video, and then I decided to take care of some squash bugs and pull out some plants and whatnot. And then we just had the craziest thunderstorms just roll through here. So we had like thunder, lightning, it just poured. And then the sun came out and the clouds cleared. So I wanted to come out here and attempt to prune the tomato plants. Now, I don't claim to be an expert in tomato pruning in any way, shape, or form. I don't claim to be an expert when it comes to gardening in any way, shape, or form either. When it comes to tomato pruning, some people can make it quite political. They get really attached to the greenery. I don't know, but some people get very upset over this subject. I don't know. You tell me. Who are you voting for? I don't know. When it comes to the issue of tomato pruning, some people do it and they're really against it and they never do it again. And some people do it and they're really for it. And either side, there's going to be somebody telling you that if you're not doing it their way, you're doing it wrong. And I'm here to tell you that it's not wrong to leave your tomato plants as is, and it's also not wrong to cut at them. With that said, whether or not you should be pruning your tomato plants personally or not, ask around, find out what people do in your area, gather a little bit of information online, and then do whatever you want. You don't even have to tell them what you're doing. So with all of that said, let's talk about the two different types of tomatoes when it comes to pruning. Now, there are thousands of tomato varieties ranging from various colors of red, orange, yellow, green, striped, speckled, purple, and even black. But all of your tomatoes are going to fall into one of two categories. This is going to be determinate or indeterminate. So this is one of those things that's actually kind of tricky and easy to get mixed up, and so this is how I remember it. A determinate variety of tomato reaches a determined size and has a determined amount of fruit, as where an indeterminate variety reaches an indeterminate size and also has an indeterminate amount of fruit. First off, you have your determinate varieties. A determinate tomato is usually a tomato that what it does is it puts on its blossoms and sets its fruit all at once. Then it ripens all at once and you harvest it all at once, and then the plant actually dies, and that's the end of its life cycle. Now, the reason these are such a great thing to have in the garden is because these are excellent for canning and preserving. So if you want to do a bunch of salsa, a bunch of diced, canned, crushed tomatoes, tomato soup, whatever you want to do, these are really excellent for that because a bunch of them come in all at once and you have enough to do something with, so you can really do a lot of preserving with those. Now, another really cool thing about determinate varieties is they are ideal for small spaces and containers. So if you live, in an apartment or you have a small patio, or maybe you just don't have a super big backyard, it is an excellent variety to use because you can put more in a smaller space because they're not going to get as big. They're also going to produce a lot at once, so you can produce a lot of produce from a small space. The other awesome thing about them is they don't require super heavy trellising. Because the plants don't get super big, they're not going to need super heavy duty trellising. Now, that's not to say they don't need any trellising, but it just doesn't have to be quite as heavy duty as with the indeterminate varieties. Next up, you have your indeterminate varieties. If you want tomatoes all summer long and you want those super cool varieties that are stripy, maybe you want a Jubilee or a Black Beauty, then you're going to want to grow some indeterminate varieties in your garden. Indeterminate varieties are going to get much, much bigger. They're going to need more sturdy, reinforced trellising systems to keep them up. They're also going to need a little bit more space. So with a determinate variety, like we mentioned earlier, like your Romas, you might could get away with planting them every 12 inches and keeping that spacing apart. But with your indeterminates, they really do benefit from having 2 feet or 24 inches apart. The thing about indeterminates is that they are going to produce their entire life cycle, and they're not going to die until overcome by disease, pest pressure, or until the first frost. This means that an indeterminate variety of tomato actually has the capability of giving you more produce than that of a determinate variety, making it an excellent thing to have in the garden because not only will it give you more produce over a longer period of time, but it can also give you larger fruits. Now, if you're unsure as to whether or not your tomato variety that you have planted in your garden is an indeterminate or a determinate variety, it's usually going to tell you at the back of the seed packet if you started it from seed, or on the plant tag if you got it from the store. Now, if all else fails, you can always ask someone, or you can just do a quick internet search and it'll probably most likely tell you. And if the internet fails you, honestly, it's just a surprise. Now, the reason it matters to know whether or not your plant is an indeterminate or determinate variety is because this matters when it comes to pruning. Now, all tomatoes, whether that be indeterminate, determinate varieties, small, medium, or large tomatoes, all grow something that we refer to here as plant suckers. A plant sucker is simply a part of the plant that grows between the main stem and the leaf, producing almost like its own plant that sucks energy out of the main stem to grow its own fruit and its own blossoms, and actually its very own suckers itself. One stem can have many suckers. You can see there's one just starting right there. There's not one there. You can see that this branch right here, this entire branch here, got quite large because this never got trimmed off. Now, when you're pruning an indeterminate variety, you prune the suckers off. But if you're pruning a determinate variety, you leave the suckers on. And here's why. Now, an indeterminate variety like these grape tomatoes here have an indeterminate amount of fruit. And so they haven't been bred to create a specific quantity of produce. That being said, I can trim on those plants all day long and it's not going to hurt them. In fact, it's going to be beneficial because if I just let them grow and grow and grow and grow, they might shroud themselves and end up being their own worst enemy. And so by trimming off the extra unnecessary foliage, by trimming off those unnecessary excess suckers, I can actually help enhance the fruit production, the size of the fruit, the quantity of fruit, the quality of fruit, without harming my actual number of harvest. Quantity was the word I was looking for, the quantity of harvest. But these Oregon spring tomatoes are a different story. Much like aroma, Oregon spring tomatoes are a determinate variety of tomato. This means that they have been specifically bred to create a determined amount of fruit, a specific amount of produce. And by cutting off suckers, you're cutting off potential blossoms, so you're cutting off potential harvest, and you don't want to do that. Now, whether or not you should be growing indeterminate or determinate varieties in your garden really doesn't matter. It is entirely up to you and what you want to do in your garden space. I mean, do what brings you pleasure, right? You're the one who's got to be out there in the garden weeding. You're the one who's got to be preserving and eating your own produce. So do what brings you joy, what you enjoy doing. Do what you like, and don't take it too seriously because it's not that serious. They're tomatoes, for crying out loud. So before we get started, there's a couple things you're going to want to grab. A nice sharp pair of pruners or clippers, rag, a paper towel, something to wipe your clippers off with. The next thing you're going to want is some rubbing alcohol. Now, I don't have any rubbing alcohol in hand, so something you can use, which I'm going to be using today, is some warm soapy water with some vinegar poured in it. Now, what this is going to do is this is going to clean and disinfect the clippers between each cutting. So essentially what will happen is between every, 3 or 4 plants, I'm going to go back, I'm going to clean off the clippers really, really good, and then jump right back into it. That way, if you accidentally pick up a disease and you spread it, hopefully, fingers crossed, you're only spreading it to a couple of plants, not your entire tomato patch. Now, something I want to mention is diseased plants. Typically what I do in the situation of a diseased plant is I will actually skip over that and I will come back to it very last and decide what to do with it. If I feel like it's not that bad and I want to try and save it, then I might try and save it by using a baking soda water mix or a milk water mix to try and revive the tomato plant, depending on what the situation is looking like. But if it's got a lot of spots on it and I look like, the leaves are all curled, it's covered in black and brown spots, I usually rip it out and burn it because I'm not willing to risk all of these other tomato plants for just one tomato plant. I grew them all from seed, and I'd rather get rid of 4 or 5 or maybe even 10 or 15 plants and rip them out and burn them than sacrifice the rest of the other plants, because a lot of work went into it and I don't want it to be messed up by one tomato plant. So that's my personal preference when dealing with tomatoes. I have found, in my opinion, I have not been able to successfully save a tomato plant from disease, so my mode of operation is to just pull them out and burn them. You don't want to spread disease to the other plants by putting it in your compost bin. So it either needs to go in the trash can or go in the fire pit to be burned so that disease won't spread to all of your other plants. Now, something that I do that was a huge game changer in the garden is I started pruning off all the bottom leaves for at least 6 inches up on our tomato plants. Now, essentially what was happening was splashback, and that's where when it's raining or when it's watering, it hits the ground, it splashes up onto the leaves, and then you end up with a breeding ground for disease on your leaves. The best way to cope with this is by cutting off all of these bottom leaves, and essentially, you end up with a nice clean stalk at the bottom that doesn't harbor disease. So I had somebody on Instagram ask me, how do I know what to take off of the tomato plants when I'm pruning them? I make sure that if there's any leaves touching the ground or too close to the ground, that I remove those leaves. On determinate varieties, I do not remove suckers, but on indeterminate varieties, I remove most suckers. I get rid of any leaves that look unnecessary. They're crowding. Maybe they're around maybe they're crowding around some fruits. Maybe they're crowding around some blossoms. And I'm going to get rid of them because there's just too much and they don't need to be there. And the last thing I left them with was you got to use your best judgment. So when it comes to pruning your tomato plants, you do just have to use your best judgment. Something I would say is it's better to prune not enough than too much on a plant, because you can always go back and prune more later. It's kind of like when you're cutting someone's hair, it's better not to try and gouge it. It's better to leave it a little on the long side while you're practicing cutting hair instead of going too short. So if you're unsure of yourself, just go a little longer. Same thing with plants. But the more you do something, the more comfortable you become with doing it. It is scary to cut on your tomato plants for the first time. It scared me a lot. And so if you're worried about trimming your tomato plants, don't worry about it. It's, if the plant dies and it wasn't meant to live, and if it all works out, awesome, you did it right. See what happens next year, prune them next year. Your plants, when you should start pruning them is as soon as possible, but if they get a little overgrown, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with having slightly overgrown tomato plants, and there is nothing wrong with pruning a plant that's already pretty big and producing fruit. You can still prune on those plants. That's how I prune. Maybe that was, I hope that was helpful. So here's a little bit of an up close, kind of on my thought process as I'm pruning these tomato plants. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna come in here. I'm gonna remove all of these lower leaves. And the reason I'm gonna remove all these lower leaves is because they're touching the ground. Some of these are just too close and I really don't want them super close to the ground. But I'm just gonna come in here and I'm just gonna prune them off. Now, I did go ahead and remove that sucker there because it was a little crowded in there. I'm removing these yellowed leaves. I'm gonna remove this sucker as well. Suckers can be rooted, so if you wanna take this, remove these, you can actually snip the blossoms off as well. You can actually root that and have an entire new tomato plant. You can see that all of these stalks at one point were suckers, and some of them are kind of too big to prune off, not all of them. And that's one of those things where I'm just not ready to make that decision right now. Maybe later I'll feel more comfortable and I'll decide to prune off a bunch of them, but in the meantime, I'm gonna leave them just because. But I'm just kind of coming in here and I'm just taking it off, and I'm being pretty ruthless. I'm not overly attached to any of this foliage, and I'm just getting rid of it. In this space right here, it's a little crowded and I want to open it up. I want to bring some sunlight straight down through here. So I'm actually going to cut this one off because it's the tallest one. I'm going to leave these ones. This one's a little close for splashback. This one's way down back here, so I'm going to trim off that back leaf. And then that's about it. I'm gonna leave this plant. It's done being pruned. I've got it really opened up. I'm gonna get it tied up, and I will try and be more diligent with getting these tomatoes whipped into shape and then keeping them that way. And then here's just a quick example of how I prune the determinate varieties right here. So I'm just gonna come in here, and they kind of grow in together. It ends up getting a little more complicated because the other ones I end up taking off so much. I end up taking off a lot of suckers and stuff, so it's kind of easier to get in there. And these ones are a little bit tighter. But I just kind of come in here and I'm removing all these bottom leaves. So there you go. That's kind of a rough prune on a determinate variety and how I kind of go about pruning those. Just a little bit more simply. Just getting rid of those bottom leaves. Thank you all so much for tuning in with me in today's video. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you found it helpful. If you liked it, please let me know by giving it a big thumbs up. It really helps out the channel and lets me know what type of content you guys like to be seeing. Feel free to click that big red subscribe button if you want to stick around, and to never miss a brand new upload, all you gotta do is click that bell icon. Feel free to comment down below. I absolutely love hearing from you all so much. I hope you have a absolutely wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you all later. Bye-bye.